Wow, there's some wonderful speakers here today. I just want to kind of have everyone give a round of applause for putting this together. The folk that put this together are pretty awesome, right? Yeah. And I don't know if you know it or not, but this institution has helped to guide a lot of my life's work. It's helped to guide a lot of people in this country. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that the President of the United States was here at this institution, I think on this very stage. I want to talk about something we don't often see. I'm a sociologist, and I can actually say that now because I graduated, right? I'm a sociologist, and I study the institutions and the impact they have on people. But also I study how people have impacts on institutions. And I think we don't really know how often we are touched and shaped by institutions, how often they guide our lives and shape our decisions and take away opportunities. This is me in 1990, yes, 30 years old. This is my mother. And I was born into a family, my biological mother and my biological father were not there for me. They weren't there for me for problems of their own sake. They had problems with substance abuse, right? And so my mother, who you see here in the picture, is my grandmother. She happens to be my grandmother. And her husband, my grandfather, both adopted me when I was about 2 years old. And I remember one thing my grandfather told me once before. He said, "You know, Brandon, I remember your great-grandma. She wanted us to make a promise. And she said," I was with my sister Danielle, and she said, "You know, I want you to promise me that no matter what happens, you won't split them up. And I also want you to promise me that you'll take care of them." And now at the time, my grandfather was having problems of his own. And so he found this quite difficult. But he and his wife, my mother, they adopted me. I was about 3 years old. They moved to the other side of the town because I could hardly afford anything in the city in Oklahoma. And then at that point, I guess I was kind of saved, right? And this was my first touch point with institutions, right? The adoption agency. I had no control over that, but that institution influenced my life for the rest of my life. And then I think at that point, fast forward to 2015, somehow I made it to Georgetown, and I graduated. And I'm still in amazement by this, and you will too. If you're a graduate or a person in the college, you'll also experience this. I had family that came to me, and they were really excited, and it was really interesting to me because I just paid attention to doing the work. I didn't really pay attention to like when I would get to this point, but I ended up graduating somehow, right? And it changed my life. It really changed my life. So I want to talk to you about how institutions really shaped my life. And I was a very, to say the least, difficult young boy. I just wanted to fit in. I wanted to be cool. And one of the things that I did to be cool is when I was in middle school, I took a pellet gun to school. And the pellet gun looked like a real gun. It did not look like the pellet gun that it was. And subsequently, I was expelled from school. I was expelled from school for the rest of the year, which was following probably about 40 days. And so I came home, and of course, I have to break the news to my granddad before the school does, right? Because that's what an honest kid would do. And I'm talking to my granddad, and I'm like, Dad, I took this gun to school. I didn't mean to. And that created a lot of tension in my household, and I couldn't handle it. I ran away. I left. I ran away from my home. I was about 14 years old, and I didn't know the power of influence at that point, but my younger cousin, who was also adopted by my parents, ran away too. And I thought, wow, okay, great. Well, I'm definitely on a roll here. I'm setting an example, aren't I? And then, if that wasn't enough, my good friend, my best friend, he ran away too. And so now I have two people really close to me who have ran away. And I also want to say they were also, experiencing trouble in their homes as well. But nonetheless, I had set some sort of example, right? And so when I ran away, I dropped out of high school. Dropped out of high school when I was 15 years old. And I ended up not having a place to stay. I didn't know anyone. I had been sheltered, so I hadn't had an experience of using public transportation. I didn't know where to get a job, if they were going to give a job to a 15-year-old kid. I didn't know how to live. So I lived like this. This is the room that I stayed in. I lived in an abandoned house for a year and a half. How did I get by? I sold drugs. That's how I got by. And the opportunity here is really different, because the institution that helped to shape my life at this point was the education system. It had thrown me out. It had said, hey, look, here's this kid that has this pellet gun. And I had an experience there. And this was following the Columbine shooting, if anyone remembers that. And so you can imagine the tension that kind of was in the air around this issue. So they acted hard, right? And rightfully so. But that institution shaped my life. And a lot of people might say, look at this experience and say, hey, this institution, really created a lot of havoc for Brandon. But actually, for me, it was an opportunity. See, my best friend became my support system. He and I lived in this abandoned house. He and I worked odd jobs together. And that best friend became my partner. He became my support system. He became, in fact, my boyfriend. And so, for me, it was this opportunity to look back and say, wow, the opportunity that I have with this person to grow and to be a part of this person's life is something amazing. And it happened by accident, and it's definitely the case that I didn't want it to happen that way, but it happened. So, because there's nothing else really to do, at this point, I want to talk to you first about what changed during that time. And what changed during that time for me is, I'll never forget it. It was a fall day, and I was selling drugs on the corner, and the person that walked up to me, someone that I knew. And that person was my aunt. The woman's, my cousin, his mother. So on the other side of the sale is my aunt, who's asking me for drugs. And I didn't think about this at the time, but there wasn't a space for her to learn how to be anything other than what she was. So for her, she was in and out of jail. She struggled with substance abuse, with using crack. And instead of a place where she could be rehabilitated, right? Because this is actually what we need. We need places of rehabilitation. We don't need places of enslavement or places in incarceration. We need you to become a more contributing citizen of our society. This is what I thought. So really that changed my life forever. I said, you know what? I can't do this anymore. I literally cannot do this anymore. So following 2003, I joined the Army as a satellite engineer. This is really where I learned of another institution. And this institution was an institution of definitely hypermasculinity. It was definitely an institution where I felt like I needed to be in the right place at the right time, or else, right? It's kind of your experience in the military. And so I left home. I shipped off to Germany, which was my first duty station. And I still remember the first duty station I was there. I was really afraid. I mean, I had to be a 19-year-old kid, and I'm in Germany. And the reason, they didn't tell me that the first thing I thought was, wow, I'm going to Germany. I'm going to be able to live in another country. This is fantastic. How many people get to do this? But, you know, one of the things they didn't disclose to you at first is the people that go to Germany or overseas at first are usually the first people to ship out to go into war. Because, right, you know, you're the first people, you're outside. It's very easy for you to ship off and go somewhere else. And so, though I was really excited to be in Germany, that excitement didn't last very long. Because about 6 months later, I was being shipped to Kuwait so that we could convoy to Iraq. This was right after 2003, during the war. And I remember getting into the plane to take off to Kuwait, getting off the plane, and I'm thinking to myself, as I'm getting off the plane, wow, you know, the heat from this engine is just like, it's like unbearable. I was like, they got to do something about that. And I'm like walking, and I'm walking, and I'm walking, and I'm like, you know, that's not the heat from the engine of the plane. It's that hot here. And so I realized at that point, I had another enemy I hadn't really thought about, and that was the heat. And so I want to briefly talk about, I laugh about that experience, but that experience also changed my life. That was a way that an institution shaped my life. I know I never want to visit places in the Middle East that are as hot as Kuwait. But another thing I know, while I was getting on a plane, I received a phone call. And the phone call was from a friend of mine back home, back in Oklahoma. And he was kind of upset, and he has this level of frustration in his voice, and he says, Brandon, you know, I just want to talk to you. And I thought, okay, well, you know, I'm about to board this plane. I mean, this is not really a good time to have a chit-chat. Is this something really pressing? It's like, yeah. I'm just calling to tell you, Brandon, I'm really sorry that, you know, your partner, he was killed. You know, he was killed, and he was killed by police in Oklahoma. And he said he was killed. And when he said he was killed, I knew the he meant. He never said a name. He never talked to me about what happened. I just remember my knees buckling. That's it. I don't remember anything beyond that. I literally, at that point, remember people helping me up. It was a devastating experience for me. I don't think I've ever experienced anything like that in my life. And it was really because he was like you know, my grandparents at that time, I took a gun to school and they kicked me out. You know, they're not going to talk to me that often. So I didn't have a lot of experience chatting with my family. He was really, you know, he was a tether to my outside world beyond Germany. And that had shattered. And that really broke me. And I stand here and saying that now, probably because I can look back on it. But like, he was a person really that I was vulnerable with. And I know we talk very often about this hot word and this push-button word about vulnerability. But for me, I felt that here it is, a place where I had been vulnerable with the person that I loved and I cared about. And I had offered myself to institutions like education systems, like the military system. But these institutions, for some reason, didn't keep my partner safe. Of course, this is not the thing I'm thinking about at the moment, but it's definitely something I thought about. I thought, here I am, I'm serving overseas, I literally have a weapon in my hand, and I'm susceptible myself to great danger. My job was to go out and to build a satellite in a remote access unit, me and 2 other guys, or a girl. And what would happen is that one of those people would be on duty and the other 2 would be putting up a satellite in the middle of nowhere, the desert. I want really that to sink in. If you just go to the country somewhere, and I mean like the country, outside in the country, and did that, it would be tough. Do that in the desert in a foreign country and talk about vulnerability, subjecting yourself to this level of vulnerability that is unconscionable sometimes. It's hot, like I said, about 140 degrees, but it's really cold when it jumps down to 80 degrees, and it's been 140 or 150 degrees outside. So, fast forward, I got out of the military. I talked about my experience, and in an effort to go and visit my partner's grave and be at his funeral, my first-line supervisor told my commanding officer, and my commanding officer said, "Brandon Anderson, surrender your weapon and expect a dishonorable discharge by the end of the week." And so, an institution that I had been in for 5 years really had shifted and changed my life forever at that moment. And for that being the case, what really happened for me is I thought, wow, okay, well, I don't really want that to happen. I'd like to continue serving, but I'm not really sure if I want to be in an institution that doesn't value me the way that I think it should value me. And so I didn't fight that, but I did fight the honorable. I thought I'd serve my country honorably, so I ended up fighting that charge and helped 6 others do the same thing, and we successfully secured an honorable discharge for me and 6 other soldiers. And I submit to you my time at Bellevue College is just a way for me to enter into another institution, right? Here I am, I'm accepting what I've given, I'm accepting what I've been given, and I'm saying, look, all right, I'm going to make with what I have. I'm going to do with what I have. I'm going to try to do what I wanted to do before, right? And during the time, really what I had learned was, wow, well, a lot of the times that I'm hearing right now is people are, like around this time, are being shot and killed by police as well. It's so funny. It's so funny that the reason Tamir Rice, who was a 12-year-old kid who was shot less than 2 seconds, it took an officer less than 2 seconds to fire his weapon on a 12-year-old kid with what? A BB gun. And I stopped to think about that, and I thought, wow, 10 years ago, I had a BB gun, and I took it into a school with other kids, not at a park like Tamir. I really had to ask myself, are we getting better? Or is this becoming more of a problem? And so ironic is that it's remarkable how the people we seek to help are really the people that teach us the most about our lives, the most about ourselves, about love, and about vulnerability. That 12-year-old kid was vulnerable in a park by himself. And so I want to end with this. I want us to think about vulnerability not in the sense of it being the core of shame and unworthiness. I want us to think of it as being the birthplace of joy, of creativity, but also that oftentimes when people, especially communities of color, engage with institutions that when they are vulnerable, oftentimes it's incredibly difficult because they are rewarded not with the same sorts of experiences as we all do. And so for me, vulnerability in my life was difficult to capture. My vulnerability was a liability in anything. It was a liability to me for a reason. I had had a partner who'd been killed. I had a mother who struggled with drugs. I also had been thrown out of the military. So for me, imagine that, and imagine not having an experience that you wanted when you were vulnerable, and then the rest of your life, you're not necessarily thinking about how to be vulnerable. Frankly, you're thinking about how can I go through life not being vulnerable and still get what I want? But the problem is that in order to build meaningful and intimate relationships, vulnerability is the one thing we need. So how is it that in a world where vulnerability is what we need, the one thing, that which is a liability for multiple communities throughout this country, throughout this world? So I want us to think about institutions not as necessarily being oppressive in the sense that they don't allow us to get the job we want, they don't allow us to continue education. No, social upward mobility is important, but I also want us to think about how institutions are compressing at the same time, in the sense that they are pervasive, that they disallow and preclude one another from contributing successfully to society. It's concrete if you think about it. And what's funny is that we all know Tupac Shakur, and he talks a lot about this. I had known it at that time. But Tupac often said, if we knew the struggle of the rose that rose above the concrete, that grew from the concrete, we wouldn't be asking about how did its petals become damaged and all of that. We'd be thinking about, wow, look at its reach to the sun. Look how this rose has grew from concrete. That is what I want you to think about the next time you see someone wanting to be vulnerable. Don't think about the damaged petals. Don't think about the time it took it to grow. Think about what it grew from. Thank you.